Sunday school time. Here we go. All right. Everybody get a seat. Okay. Now stand up. Let's open with a word of prayer. Lord, we love you. We thank you for your great, wonderful love for us beyond measure, beyond understanding or comprehension. We thank you, Lord, for all you do for us each and every day. Most of all, we thank you for Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, and for the time when you opened the gospel to us and made known to us your wonderful gift of grace through salvation. I ask you to be with us this morning in Sunday school and then later in the morning services. Pray for your will to be done as we contemplate some wonderful truths that everyone needs to know. And ask your blessings upon Brother Jay, our speaker, and ask your blessings upon our hearts as we hear and receive. Have your way in all of it. For your honor and glory, we'll praise you in Christ's name. Amen. Be seated. Paul's going to lead us in a chorus.
75 is a great song. It's probably still kind of new to some of you, but it's great. We're learning. I think it's certainly appropriate for our Sunday school hour. It's called The God of the Impossible, number 75. So if you know it, give it an extra boost. Help those around you that may not know it. I don't know how God hangs the world on nothing, but I know that God cares for me. Sing it now. I don't know how God hangs the world on nothing. Planets each in place. I cannot count the sands upon the seashore, the stars that float in space. But God can do what seems impossible. God controls eternity. My mind can never comprehend it. In heaven cares for me. On the last, I don't know how the forever, or just how long it's been since time began. I can't explain how Christ, who is eternal, could come to earth and die for sinful man. But God can do what seems impossible. God controls eternity. My mind can never comprehend it, but God in heaven cares for me.
Okay, it's good to have our friends from the Creation Expo with us this morning. Good to have Dr. J. Wile back again this year. We enjoyed our time with him last year, and almost right afterwards, I scheduled him to come back now. So good to have him, and good to have Dr. J. He's going to come and lead us in Sunday school.
Okay. Hey, Jay. Yeah. Oh, I'm here. Oh, you're here. You made it. Nice of you to show up. Well, I'll tell you a story. It's been a long weekend. Okay. Do you want to start? No, okay. All right. Very good. That's my boss. He's just... Okay. So welcome. I have to say, before I start, that song they sang the last time I was here, and it was the first time I'd ever heard it. Yeah, and it became a hymn that I really like. And I talked in, pardon me? Is my mic not on? Let's see. It says it is. Oh, it's on mute. How do I turn mute off? Oh, mute. There we go. Aha. Look at that. Look at that. It makes a difference. So anyway, I had not heard that song before, and obviously I really like it now. But I talked in the morning service about God hanging the earth on nothing. Because, of course, the earth is out there just hanging on nothing. And that was different from all the other cultures at the time the Bible, the time of the Old Testament. All the other cultures thought the earth had to be put on something. So the earth was being held up by a titan or held up by an elephant or something like that. The Jews had it right, that the earth was hung on nothing, because they just believed their scriptures. And so in the end, they had it way ahead of science. It took science a long time to catch up with Scripture on how the earth is hung in space. I thought that was really cool that there's a hymn about that. I didn't even know about it. So what I want to talk about this morning is the lies evolutionists must tell. And they must tell a lot of lies because in the end, if you look at the case, evolution doesn't have a very strong case. There was probably a time in history when we didn't know a lot of science where evolution had a pretty strong scientific case. Nowadays, there's very little to support evolution, so as a result, in order to get people to believe what they want you to believe, in the end, evolutionists have to lie, and I'm going to give several examples of that in this Sunday school hour. Sometimes it's a deliberate lie. Sometimes they simply say things that aren't true, and it's amazing that they get away with it in times when anybody can Google anything. In the end, if you simply Google some of the things they say, you know it's a lie. But nevertheless, sometimes it's deliberate. Sometimes they unknowingly spread falsehoods. Now, sometimes they just don't understand the situation. They don't know the latest science. And so in the end, sometimes it's unknowing, but they still end up spreading falsehoods. And sometimes they lie by committing actions that keep people from learning the truth. That's another form of lie, and I'm going to give examples of all of this in this particular time we have together. So, I want to start with one of evolution's older lies, and you might wonder why I'm starting with a lie that's so old, but I want to tell you'll learn in the end. This lie was produced by Ernest Haeckel. He was a very important biologist at the turn of the century, and he ended up making an incredible distinction between cells that we still use to this day. He was the first one, if you know biology, to make the distinction between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So this guy wasn't a slouch. And he wasn't a bad scientist, except he felt the need to lie about evolution. So he's the author of one of evolution's oldest lies. He was looking at embryos. So animals and people who were still forming in the womb. And he said that if he looked at, say, a salamander developing in the egg and a human developing in the womb, there are remarkable similarities between the way the salamander's embryo develops and the way the human embryo develops. And as a result, he came up with what he called the biogenetic law. Now, even though the biogenetic law is an outright fabrication, it has one of my favorite phrases in it. And if you ever want to sound scientific, all you do is have to say this: ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Doesn't that sound scientific? What it means is ontogeny is development before you're born or hatched or whatever. So looking at embryos is studying ontogeny. Phylogeny is supposed evolutionary relationships. So he said, as you develop in the womb, you go through all of the evolution that produced you. And he had a lot of drawings that supposedly bolstered his argument. Now you can see it's 1868, so it's a long time ago. And that actually becomes very important in a minute. So, long time ago. And here were his drawings. And you probably can't read what's going on here, but I'll tell you. This is the earliest stages of all these embryos. Here's a fish, a salamander, a chicken, actually this is a turtle, a chicken. This is a pig, and this is a human being. All right? And so what he's saying is initially, look, all of these animals, whether it's a fish or a human being, their initial stage of development is remarkably similar. Now, as you start letting them develop more, they eventually start looking different. But notice that these guys still look very similar because supposedly these guys are closer in evolutionary relationships. Pigs are closer to humans than fish are. So in the end, he said, look, if you just watch the development of these organisms before they're hatched or before they're born, you'll actually see evolution take place. And in the end, the more evolutionary related the two organisms are, the more similar their embryonic development. And this was very, very convincing to a lot of people. However, it's an outright fabrication. Because here is his first stages: fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, rabbit, human. This is his drawings. Here are actual photos. Do those drawings look anything like the photos? No. Not at all. Even initially, they don't look like the photos. So he was looking at these embryos. It wasn't like he didn't have the ability to do that. So he outright fabricated these drawings because, in the end, it's such a convincing idea that as you develop in the womb, you go through all those evolutionary relationships again. Very, very attractive idea. So he simply doctored the drawings to make it work. Here's the problem. It was known within about 20 years that he was doctoring his drawings because other people looked at the same embryos he was looking at, and they wrote letters to the journals saying, look, we don't see this. We see very different. However, it's so appealing to evolutionists that the fraudulent nature of the data was overlooked for nearly 100 years. People kept producing this, even though they knew it was wrong. In 1997, an international team of experts met to analyze the drawings and compare them to well-known data. And they said, they finally admitted officially, it's a fake. In fact, one of the members of the committee, Michael Richardson, says, looks like it's turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology. Now that was in 1997. And it was determined by a panel of experts that it was one of the most famous fakes in biology. So that should be the end of the story, right? After 1997, we shouldn't hear about this anymore, right? Wrong. In fact, Casey Luskin compiled a list of 8 biology textbooks between 2006 and 2013, published in those dates, that still use either Haeckel's own drawings or very similar drawings to support evolution. Once again, 1997 is when it was officially pronounced as a fake, right? Still, 2006 to 2013, these books are still using it. I actually got an email from a student, this was back in 2006, so it was a while ago, and she said this, today I took the Stanford Achievement Test. This is one of these standardized tests that we use to gauge how well a student has learned things. Now the Stanford Achievement Test is actually 4 different grades. So she was taking the high school Stanford Achievement Test. And in the science portion, one of the questions was based on Haeckel's chart. I was really shocked that scientists would really use incorrect charts and diagrams. Unfortunately, Kirsten, I wasn't shocked at all because this is such an appealing picture. You see the embryos, you see their similarities. This looks like evolution. So even though it's a complete fake, it still survives because it's so appealing. And in fact, here's the nasty little secret. If you want a bad idea to be perpetuated in any field, whether it's science or math or history, make sure it's on the SAT or make sure it's on one of these Stanford Achievement Tests. Stanford Achievement Test is not the SAT, it's something different. Make sure it's on one of these standardized tests. Because if it's on a standardized test, guess what? Teachers will teach it. So in the end, you want to perpetuate a myth, make sure it stays on the tests. That's how the business works. So in the end, unfortunately, Kirsten was shocked. I wasn't at all. And in fact, even though this was 2006 to 2013, I'm sure if I picked up a high school biology textbook today that was published within the last few years, I'll eventually find one that has Haeckel's chart. Because once again, it's so convincing. Who cares that it's not true? Well, I kind of care. But obviously the evolutionists don't very much. And that's what you see if you look especially at science education from an evolutionary point of view throughout history, really. One thing that's very common and we talk about a lot is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. You get a bacterial infection, you go to the doctor gives you an antibiotic, right? That antibiotic is supposed to kill all the bacteria. And so in the end, the hope is those bacteria then will all die out and you'll recover from the infection. However, sometimes well-known antibiotics don't work on a person because that person has been infected by a type of bacteria that resists the antibiotic. And the standard evolutionary view is that this developed in bacteria after the antibiotics were made. And this is a classic case of evolution. Make an antibiotic, bacteria evolve a way to resist it. Here's how Biology, the Dynamics of Life, which is a high school biology textbook, says it. The development of bacterial resistance to antibiotics is direct evidence for evolution. And you hear that a lot. And in fact, I was watching television not all that long ago, and a doctor was saying, well, you know, if I didn't believe in evolution, I wouldn't believe that bacteria were antibiotic resistant, and therefore I wouldn't be a very good doctor. So obviously, you need to believe in evolution to be a good doctor. But the fact is, there are two ways that bacteria develop antibiotic resistance, and none of them support evolution. This was first figured out in 1990, so it wasn't all that, it was pretty far long ago. A group of researchers revived bacteria frozen in the intestines from explorers 150 years ago. So there was a famous expedition called the Franklin expedition, and a lot of the explorers died. And of course, they were in the Arctic, so they just froze. And so they eventually found the bodies, brought them back, and since they were frozen, certain things were preserved pretty well, and they actually found some bacterial spores, and they wondered, could we revive these bacteria? So sure enough, they did. They put them in the right environment. The bacteria came back to life, and some of those bacteria were already resistant to two antibiotics that had been made 100 years after the explorers died. So 150 years ago, bacteria were resistant to at least some of our modern antibiotics, long before antibiotics were around. All right, so that should tell you that it's not evidence for evolution, because that resistance, at least, occurred long before the antibiotics were developed. So how do bacteria become antibiotic resistant? There are two ways. We now know. Some of them have genes that produce proteins that fight the antibiotic. So you give an antibiotic, if they have the right genes, they can produce another chemical that destroys the antibiotic. And as a result, they're antibiotic resistant. It was originally thought that these genes were produced because of evolution. We now know that's not true. I'll show you why in a minute. The other way they can do it is a mutation in their genes that makes the antibiotic less effective against them. So either they already have genes to fight the antibiotic, or a mutation occurs that makes the antibiotic less effective against them. Now, the first one provides evidence against evolution, and I'll talk about that first. The other one doesn't support evolution the way evolutionists want it to. So, the more common way the bacteria become antibiotic resistant is for them to have the genes that give them the resistance already. Well, it turns out some researchers were looking at bacterial genes found in permanently frozen soil, in the same soil where mammoth fossils are found. And mammoths, we think, are extinct. So in the end, it's thought that these bacteria were around during the time of mammoths, because they were frozen with the mammoth fossils at the same time. And they found antibiotic resistance genes. So when mammoths were walking the earth, bacteria were resistant to antibiotic genes. And what the researchers say themselves is these results show conclusively that antibiotic resistance is a natural phenomenon that predates the modern selective pressure of clinical antibiotic use. Now let's make sure you understand what they're saying here. The story you read in the textbooks is we made antibiotics, then bacteria evolved resistance to antibiotics. That's a natural phenomenon. That's modern selective pressure, the production of antibiotics. And so that's what you read. You read that the antibiotic resistance is the result of modern selective pressure of clinical antibiotic use. What they found out is not true. That bacteria were resistant to these human-made antibiotics long before the antibiotics were made. It's something that's intrinsic to bacteria. Now, what's really interesting is if you talk to some people that have a very odd form of research. They research fossilized human feces. Can you imagine going to college and thinking, that's what I want to do? I want to research fossilized human feces. Well, they were doing that, and they were looking at feces that were found from the Middle Ages. right? So this is, 1200, 1300 AD, long before antibiotics were around. They found antibiotic-resistant genes as well in the bacteria, but what they found was there were more antibiotic-resistant genes in the Middle Ages than there are now. So the bacteria were resistant to a wider range of antibiotics before we even made them. By the time we got around to making them, they had less antibiotic-resistant genes. What does that tell you? Obviously, these genes are useful for something. Long before modern antibiotics were made, the bacteria were using it for something. Over time, they lost some of those genes. Now, is that evolution? No, that's devolution. If you lose genes over time, that means your genetics aren't as good anymore. And in fact, that's what we seem to see. When we study genetics, what we seem to find is rather than genomes getting bigger over time and getting more genes and so forth, we actually find them getting smaller over time, having less genes. Geneticist Dr. John Sanford predicted this about 10 years before this study was done. He said, if we can really find old bacteria, we'll find they have fewer antibiotic-resistant genes than modern bacteria. The reason? Over time, genomes get worse. They deteriorate. And we know that. We know that. I mean, look at the Bible. Look at the Old Testament. Have you ever wondered why the old patriarchs lived to such an old age? Methuselah, all those patriarchs, why they lived to such an old age? It was because their genomes, their DNA, weren't as mutated as ours is today. The human genome is deteriorating because of mutations. So we aren't nearly as healthy. We aren't nearly as productive in terms of our biology anyway, as people 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago. Now, modern medicine may help us live longer and things like that, but the fact is, in the very early times when there was very little mutation going on, our DNA was pristine. And as a result, we were healthier, we lived longer, and everything else. A lot of what modern medicine is today is fighting the deterioration that's taking place in our genome. If you're interested in more of that, Dr. Sanford's written a book called Genetic Entropy, and he basically shows how if you just look at the human genome over time, it has lost genes. It has deteriorated. If you've ever tried to read some of the ancient philosophers, like have you ever read Plato? Have you ever been forced in college to read Plato or Aristotle or something like that? They're really hard to understand. And I honestly believe it's because they are smarter than we are. Why? Their genomes weren't as deteriorated as ours. So they were just smarter, healthier people. And in fact, there was an article written in a journal called Gene, which focuses on genetics. And it was written about 5 years ago. And the author said, if you could magically transport someone from the Middle Ages to the present, he would be smarter and happier and healthier than any of us. Because in the end, so much of our genome is deteriorated. That's what we see, and that's what's happened in these bacteria. Their genome has deteriorated. That's the opposite of evolution. So let nature take its course, and DNA doesn't get better, it deteriorates. Okay, so that's one way antibiotics get resistant. The other way bacteria get resistant to antibiotics is they experience a mutation that degrades the DNA. Because we know that happens. We know when you have a mutation, most of the time it degrades the DNA. Sometimes that helps a bacterium resist an antibiotic. And one of the classic cases is Cipro. If you have anthrax, Cipro is the standard antibiotic you use to get rid of that. However, some anthrax bacteria can mutate so that the gene that codes for a particular chemical is not right anymore. That chemical called gyrase is what Cipro targets. So the reason Cipro can kill a bacterium is it targets a very important chemical called it's called gyrase. Now, if my gene that produces this chemical deteriorates, The chemical is no longer very good. Cipro can't target it anymore. So now the bacterium is resistant to Cipro because Cipro has nothing to attack. And so it can survive Cipro, but there's a cost. In the end, that chemical that's really important doesn't work as well. So in the end, once again, that's not evolution. That's degrading DNA. When bacteria become antibiotic resistant this way, they end up having degraded DNA. That's not the kind of mutation that evolution needs. Evolution needs mutations that improve the DNA. And that doesn't happen. So in the end, even though, and your doctor may even say this, even though you might hear that bacteria have evolved resistance to antibiotics, they haven't. In fact, 500 years ago, they were more resistant to antibiotics than they are today. Exactly the opposite of evolution. That's what modern science tells us. However, if you pick up the most recent biology textbook, antibiotic-resistant bacteria is almost always mentioned as evidence for evolution, even though we've really known this since 1990. That's when that first study was done. Can't find the date now. But we've really known that since 1990. But nevertheless, modern books still use this as evidence for evolution. That's simply a lie. And if you're a textbook on science, you ought to know the science well enough to know that that's a lie. And you ought to fix that lie. But they don't. Now, some textbook authors just don't know, right? If you're a textbook author, you might not know the latest research in antibiotic resistance. So it may be an unknowing spread of falsehood. But nevertheless, if you're talking about it in a book, you ought to at least have it checked to make sure it's really true. And obviously, they're not doing that. All right, I think I talked a little bit about this last time I was here, but it's been a while ago. So let me talk about it a little bit again. One of the most fascinating things from my field is that we found carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. And that's not something that should happen if these bones are millions of years old. So here's a photo. I love this photo. This is a femur from a triceratops. Now, the femur is the bone that goes from the hip to the knee. And in most vertebrates, it's the longest bone in your body, right? And he is hacksawing into it. Why is he hacksawing into it? Because he wants to see what the chemical composition of the bone actually is. And obviously, you don't want to take the sample from the surface because there's dirt and all that other stuff there. You want to take a sample of the bone itself. So you hacksaw into it. Now, a lot of paleontologists, people who study fossils, are very hesitant to do this because these fossils are pretty rare. And so this is kind of like taking a Ming vase and just throwing it on the ground, right? You're destroying this really beautiful Triceratops femur. But if you really want to see what the chemical composition is inside the bone, it's your only choice. It's what you've got to do. Now, the reason he's doing that is he wants to see if there's any carbon-14 in the bone. What's carbon-14? Carbon-14 is a particular atom of carbon that is radioactive. You have lots of carbon atoms in your body, and some of them are radioactive, which means you are radioactive. And it gets worse. The more portly you are, like me, the more potassium you retain, and potassium also has a radioactive form. So you are actually emitting radiation to everyone else right now. And for most people, their highest exposure to radiation will be sleeping with their spouse because you're right next to a radioactive source, right? Okay, kind of scary, but your body's well designed and it can take care of those levels of radiation. If the levels of radiation get a lot higher, then there are problems. But as long as the radiation levels are what you normally experience, no problem. So carbon-14 is one of the reasons you're radioactive. Now, the reason you stay radioactive is because this carbon-14 is decaying. It's spitting out radioactive particles and becoming something completely different. It's actually becoming nitrogen. So if I had a big lump of carbon-14 in my hand, I would actually watch it slowly disappear because it would turn from black carbon into nitrogen, which is a gas, and would float away. Right? So carbon-14 disappears over time. So if you have a bunch of carbon-14 in your body, it starts to go away. However, you keep getting more carbon from your environment. Why? Because you eat. And so you're eating, so you're continually replenishing the carbon-14 in your body. So at any given time, you're about as radioactive as any other given time because you have about the same amount of carbon-14 in you. However, for most people, when you die, you stop eating. I don't think I will. I like food too much. So anyway, but for most people and animals, when they die, they stop eating. So they stop replenishing the carbon-14 in their bodies. So what happens? Whatever carbon-14 is there starts to decay away, and it never gets replaced. Now, carbon-14 can only last about 60,000 years in an organism. After 60,000 years, it has decayed so much that it's undetectable. Scientists assure us that this bone is 65 million years old. So how much carbon-14 should be in it? 0, right? Turns out that's not true. It turns out for every sample that we've been able to test of dinosaur bones, and so far it's been a total of 8 dinosaur fossils, for every dinosaur fossil we've found, there's been plenty of carbon-14 in it. As a matter of fact, if you tried to ask how old is this fossil just based on the carbon-14, that would be 39,000 years old. Now that's a lot less than 1 million years old. That's a lot older than I think it is, but nevertheless, it's a lot younger than 65 million years old. And in fact, there's a type of dating called carbon-14 dating, where they use the amount of carbon-14 in the fossil to determine how old it is. And that regularly gives them numbers like this, 39,000 years. And if they're carbon-14 dating a fossil and that fits their preconceptions, they'll say, we know this is 39,000 years because carbon-14 dating says it is. But guess what happens when carbon-14 dating says a dinosaur phone is 39,000 years old? Oh, something's wrong with the carbon-14 dating. That can't be right because we know the bone's 65 million years old. As a matter of fact, as a part of Creation Evidence Expo years ago, I did a debate with a vertebrate paleontologist, Dr. Robert Martin, and we were talking specifically about radioactive dating. And I brought up this fact that you've got these dinosaur fossils that are millions of years old. The carbon-14 dating is saying is thousands of years old. And he said, oh, that's just contamination. Something's wrong with that. Well, in the question and answer session that follows, someone asked him, how accurate is radioactive dating? And he says, oh, you know, sometimes carbon-14 dating is accurate to plus or minus 100 years. And I had to chime in, well, except for when it's dinosaur fossils, right? And then it's useless, right? And so this is another thing evolutionists do. When the data fit their preconceptions, they accept it. When the data don't fit their preconceptions, they say there's something wrong with the data. Now, a scientist, if the data contradicts the preconceptions, a scientist should say, maybe there's something wrong with my preconceptions, right? But that never seems to happen with evolutionists, right? So in the end, these dinosaur bones are neither 65 million years old nor 39,000 years old. Both of those dates are wrong. But they're clearly way incongruent from each other, indicating that at least one, if not both of the numbers are wrong. And no one wants to worry about this. In fact, here's how evolutionists respond. In order to do this kind of radioactive dating, you need a particle accelerator. Most churches don't have one, right? So when a creation scientist wants to do carbon-14 dating, what the creation scientist does is prepares the sample the way the lab tells them to prepare the sample, sends it off to a lab, and then pays the lab to do the carbon-14 analysis on the particle accelerator. The lab then gives them the results, right? That's the way it's done. Because particle accelerators are expensive. You know, even my university doesn't have one. Both universities I teach at don't have one. So in the end, if I want to do something with a particle accelerator, I have to go somewhere to do it because, you know, they're very rare. So this is the way it happens. You prepare the sample, you send it to the lab tells you how much carbon-14 is in it. Well, when these scientists published their results that said dinosaur fossils are 65 million years old, or the dinosaur fossils that are supposed to be 65 million years old have carbon-14 in them, here's how the lab responded. The lab sent the group an email, and the group said this: the scientists at CAIS, that's the place that does the carbon-14 analysis, the scientists at CAIS and I are dismayed by the claims that you and your team have made with respect to the age of the earth and the validity of biological evolution. Consequently, we are no longer able to provide radiocarbon services in support of your anti-scientific agenda. Let's unpack that for a minute. First of all, they're saying, we don't like what you're doing with our results, so we're not going to take your business anymore. Now, they're a for-profit organization. It's their right to do that. However, they're saying it's because of the scientists' anti-scientific agenda. Well, let's suppose I'm a scientist who really does believe that these bones are 65 million years old. Let's suppose I really believe that. If I'm really being a scientist and I find that there's some data that indicate they aren't, I'm going to want to do more tests, right? Because if I do more tests, either I might find that the original tests were wrong, and that would save my idea, or I might find some pattern in the data that it would at least explain why it's there. So if I want to believe these fossils are 65 million years old, and I want to behave as a scientist, what do? I do more tests. What are they saying? Because you want to do more tests, you're being anti-scientific. Isn't that crazy? But that's the kind of mental gymnastics you have to do if you want to believe this stuff. If you want to believe evolution, you want to believe the earth is billions of years old, you've got to do this. You've got to say, look, we think it's anti-scientific to do more scientific tests. And therefore, we're not going to do more scientific tests. That's what happens. And it happens a lot in evolution as well. And this is an example of them making sure that no one else finds out about this. Because if we don't do more tests, it's going to be hard to validate these data. Nevertheless, we're working, creation scientists are actually working at developing enough funding to get a particle accelerator so they can do their own tests. Hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will. But this is just so classic to me because the very people who are not being scientific are calling the other folks anti-scientific. But that's really typical with evolutionists. Now, there's another way you can respond to this whole debacle as well. You can actually just lie about what it means. And this happens too. So, these results got, published in a lot of different places and so forth. So a lot of teachers found out about these results. And so a lot of teachers sent to an organization called the National Center for Science Education, a lot of teachers sent them questions saying, how do you figure this? How can this be true, right? So a guy by the name of Philip Center wrote an article for the American Biology Teacher. And that title tells you what the journal's for. It's for biology teachers. And he was going to reassure these biology teachers that there's no way these carbon-14 dates are true. Absolutely no. They don't have to worry about it, that the fossils really are 65 million years old. He starts by saying this: bone mineral is usually useless for radiocarbon dating, thus none of these studies can be believed. Because for some reason, Center wants the biologists to think that the only thing that was tested is the mineral part of the bone. I don't know if you know a lot about bone tissue, but bone tissue has two components. There is a mineral component that makes it hard, but there's also a organic component that makes it a little flexible. And this is why a bone can get hit really hard and not break, because it can flex a little bit. So the mineral component gives it strength, and the chemical component gives it flexibility. I don't know if you've ever done this. It's one of my favorite things to have young students do. Put a chicken bone in a bowl of vinegar. Take about a week, but when you pull that bone out of that vinegar, it'll be rubber. And you'll just be able to bend it, and it won't break, and everything. Because the vinegar reacts with the minerals and gets rid of them. So the only thing left is the chemical part of the bone, the organic part of the bone. And that's what makes it flexible. So it's a neat experiment to do. You can do it next time you have chicken, if you want. So in the end, he's saying, look, you can't use the bone mineral. You can't use the stuff that makes it hard. In the end, you have to use the organic components, all right? And that statement is a lie. Because in fact, lots and lots of carbon-14 dating is done on bone mineral. Also, the studies that he's presenting don't just use bone mineral. Many of them use collagen, which is one of the organic components. All right, so in the end, that's just not true. It's a lie to begin with. Also, bone minerals are used regularly for carbon-14 dating in other fields or in the scientific literature. So for example, here's what one study puts it this way. Most Holocene samples, those are samples that are in the top layers of rock, exhibit reliable carbon-14 ages on the bioapatite fraction. Bioapatite is the mineral. Late Pleistocene samples have shown reliable results even for extremely poorly preserved bone in the cases of samples derived from a non-carbonate-rich environment. So what it's saying is, yeah, under the right circumstances, you can use bone mineral, no problem. So for Center to say you can't use bone minerals, that's a lie. We know that. The scientific research says otherwise. Also, for him to imply that only bone mineral was used in these studies is a lie, because these studies use more than just bone mineral. Some, and like my colleague in the debate that I had, say that it's a result of contamination. And one kind of contamination is nuclear reactions. Nuclear reactions occur all the time in nature. All right, and because in the end we have high energy charged particles coming at us from the sun. Most of them are deflected by the Earth's magnetic field, but some of them hit the Earth. We have neutrons coming from the sun. Those initiate all sorts of nuclear reactions. Right? Now these nuclear reactions are normal. They're not dangerous. They're part of the Earth's biosystem, so it's not a big deal. Nuclear reactions can, in principle, create more carbon-14. So one thing Center says in his article trying to appease these biology teachers is, well, even if that carbon-14 is real, it was made by nuclear reactions. And he actually gives a reference to show that nuclear reactions can produce carbon-14. And it's true, they can. His own reference says that at most, this explains 1/100th of the carbon-14 in the bone. He doesn't mention this inconvenient fact. He makes it sound like this works no matter what. So no, it's not a viable because it can't explain much of the carbon-14 that's in there. All right? Finally, he says this is the result of contamination. And that's simply not true. And we know it's not true because if we look at the data, we can see it's not true. Now, this is a ridiculously complicated graph. Don't worry about it so much. Each one of these points represents a particular dinosaur fossil. So the red squares are one dinosaur fossil, the pink triangles are another. Okay, and this dinosaur fossil here, here's how the collagen, which is one of the proteins in bone, here's how it tested. And here's how the rest of the organic chemicals tested. All right? And here's how the minerals tested. So notice that for this fossil, those represented by the squares, minerals on top, collagens in the middle, the rest of the organics are on the bottom. If this were the result of contamination, that's what should always happen. Because if it's contamination, minerals have the same chemistry, so they should be subject to the same contamination. Organics have different chemistry, they should be subject to different contamination. However, there is no pattern. For example, in this fossil, the minerals are on the bottom and the organics are on the top. And, I don't have a collagen there. So anyway, in the end, you would expect the pattern MCO to be the same for all these fossils. In fact, it's not. It's random. That's what you expect if it's not contamination. Contamination should give results that are consistent. This does not. All right, so the worst thing I think that's happened in recent time, at least among evolutionists, is how they try to lie about science history. I have a whole talk that talks about the reason we have science today is because of the medieval Christian church. If it weren't for the medieval Christian church, the science we have today would be significantly different. The science we have today is based on the scientific method. Guess who came up with that? The Bishop of Lincoln, Robert Grosseteste, in 1000 AD. He was the one who developed the scientific method. He was a priest. Like most scientists of his day, he was studying nature specifically to learn more about God. And that's how most scientists operated back in the day. So here's a modern scientist. I don't know if you know this guy, Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's a astrophysicist. He did a reboot of Carl Sagan's very popular show called Cosmos. And in it, he tells all sorts of lies about the ancient scientists. And here's the classic one. He says this about Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, who's the first one who explained really why the solar system works the way it does. Here's what deGrasse Tyson says about Newton. Newton's laws of gravity and motion revealed how the sun held distant worlds captive. His laws swept away the need for a master clockmaker to explain the precision and beauty of the solar system. Gravity is the clockmaker. So what he's saying is Newton's law of gravity got rid of the need for God. Why don't we ask Newton? In his scientific work, here's what Newton says. This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as Lord over all. That's what Newton said about gravity. This is what Tyson said about what Newton thought about gravity. Who's correct? Obviously, Newton's the one that's correct. He said that none of his equations would work if it weren't for this intelligent and powerful being. And here's another thing that I could spend a whole couple hours on this. If you read the ancient science, you just sighed, I saw it. I saw you sigh. If you read the works of scientists, even up into the 1700s, it was very common for them to reference God and talk about how God designed it this way, God did this, God did that. This is Newton's scientific paper, where he's talking about how he applied his equations to the solar system. And he's saying, look, this is because of God. We can't do that anymore. As a scientist, if I tried to reference God in one of my papers, it wouldn't be rejected for publication. So in the end, we can't write the way Newton and his predecessors wrote. And that's unfortunate. That's a whole other talk. I think that's it. Yeah. So real historians really understand what Newton was saying. Dr. Morris Klein, who is a mathematician and historian, says it this way. The thought that all phenomena of motion should follow from one set of principles might seem grandiose and inordinate, but occurred very naturally to the religious mathematicians of the 17th century. And he's talking about Newton when he's talking about them. God designed the universe, and it was expected that all phenomena of nature would follow one master plan. One mind designing a universe would almost certainly employ the same set of basic principles to govern related phenomena. So in the end, that's what motivated us to do science. Because we figured the universe was made by one being, and as a result, we should find one set of principles. That's the governing force of science. And that, my friends, comes from Christianity. That's a completely different talk. I do think that's it. All right. So I don't think we have time for questions now, but we'll do a question and answer session in the evening service. So come back for that if you have questions. Or you can talk to me individually. I'm happy to do that. I hope I didn't run too long. It's always better to ask forgiveness than permission, though, right?